Yeah, go ready to start.
Okay.
Well, today is Wednesday, July 9th, the year 2008. We're on St. Simon's Island. We are in St. Clair at the home of Charlotte Harrell. And we're going to talk about her remembrances of the Art Center and also a lot about her personal history as an artist. So, Charlotte, to start this off, where and when were you born?
I was born in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1934.
Okay. Raleigh. And what were your parents' names?
It was Helen and Bill Poole, P-O-O-L-E. Do you need separate, like her maiden name?
If you want to put that in.
Okay, it was Helen Perkinson and William R. Poole.
And where were they from? Were they from Raleigh as well?
They were both from North Carolina, and she was from a small town in North Carolina. She lived in the country, and he was a city grocer's son in Raleigh. And they met after my grandmother's family, mother's family, moved to Raleigh.
Well, did they seem kind of happy with their lives as far as you can remember, or do you think they kind of vied for something more?
Well, like everybody, Daddy read all those ads about what the best families do, which usually was own a Packard car or do these things. We never got to that. He didn't take all that seriously. But still, they always felt, we're going to do something better. It's all optimistic, that sort of thing. And of course, when I write my memoir, I'm writing, we write like that with Rosemary Danielle in Savannah. She says it's just Daniel. But when we write that memoir, we go into all the ins and outs of emotional things if we want to. So I don't know how much you want, because I was very close to both my parents, and I was the oldest daughter. Mm-hmm. So I was a good girl, so, you know what I mean?
Well,
I was very close to them.
Oh, you were?
Uh-huh.
Oh, that's good.
And I just lost them all, but both. They were long-lived, so they lived till 2000 and 2004. So they were in their 90s.
Wow.
And so they were devoted parents.
Now, did they pass away in Raleigh, or was it?
No, they were, mother was in Atlanta, and she and dad had been married for 36 years and then divorced, and he was in Florida. So, well, for the record, I can write a novel. You better not start me.
Listen, that's okay.
And if I did, it would have both of them in it.
And for the record, the names of your brothers and sisters. You're the oldest.
Okay, I'm the oldest. I had two younger sisters, much sooner than I'd have preferred, because we were only 14 months apart. And so I have one, Helen Louise Poole, and the other one is Virginia Christina Lee. And both of those, I put Helen's maiden name. Her last name is Fontseré. It's a Spanish name. It's Fontseré. But I mean, as my siblings, it was Helen and Virginia.
And let's talk about a little bit of your growing up years. Did you grow up in Raleigh?
No, I grew up first in Thomasville, Georgia. We lived in Raleigh in Washington, D.C., of all things, till I was about 3, because my father went with the government as a Department of Agriculture employee. And he started out in Washington.
Where did you first go to elementary school? Was it?
I went to
Washington?
East Side School in Thomasville, Georgia, for the first 4 years, first grade through 4th.
Okay, and then did you continue on in Thomasville, or you moved somewhere?
No, we moved to Atlanta.
To Atlanta.
Which was a big change from little Thomasville. You know, Thomasville was very sedate and dear, and Atlanta was big and booming and all of that. Yeah.
Did you finish out your high school there then?
I did.
Where did you go to high school?
I went, well, first we had to go to the 7th grade in Brown High. And then I went to Sylvan Hills, which has been closed since then, but it was a wonderful brand new high school. And I had the 10th, 11th, and 12th grades there.
Was it a coeducational
Yes.
high school?
Oh, yes. Both grammar school and high school.
When you were growing up, did you find yourself attracted to being an artist at that point, or was that something that occurred later on?
Well, you know, I drew and I made my own paper dolls, and I occupied myself for hours drawing or whatever I could get. At that time, children only got things like crayons and maybe some watercolor if you were lucky. So I made my paper dolls with crayons and tablet paper. And I was always drawing and painting, but people didn't take that seriously for a little girl, especially because all little girls did things like that. Paper dolls, drawing, coloring, they'd be happy doing it. So that's just, they said. But my dad did, about the time I was 13, for Christmas, he gave me an easel and a canvas and a little how to paint oil paint book and the oil paint set in the box. And at the same time, he gave me a Remington noiseless portable rebuilt typewriter, because I wrote and I painted, and that did it. I was going to do both from then on. You know.
So this is the age, you're 13, and so you're
12.
You're 12.
My dad gave it to me. He knew, my dad was really good about Christmas and knowing what we wanted, and I was very close to him, and he knew that, one, I hated my handwriting, and two, I wanted to be a writer. So he gave me a portable Remington typewriter, and I couldn't wait to learn to touch type. And I carried that thing all the way through getting my bachelor's degree at Georgia State. And it was stolen there, of all things. Just leave that out. But anyway, no, that I always remember that my dad gave me my two just liberating tools for what I wanted, which was one, the canvas and the easel. And, you know, we still didn't take it seriously. Before long, I was copying little classic pictures about this big, for neighbors and things. And one I discovered when I looked back was there was a story called The Necklace. I don't know if you ever read it, but it was a de Maupassant story, I think, where a young woman is lent a necklace by an older, very wealthy woman, and she loses it. And she spends her life repaying the woman, and then the woman tells her, she laughs and says, that necklace was just paste. It was not real. And so I drew a picture, and I found it in all of it. It was really as good as anything I could do now, which was of a girl with dark hair and big tears in her eyes and the necklace in her fingers. And I did the cheeks and the complexion and everything, and I thought, I was pretty good with poster paints. You know, I probably used poster paints or something.
So your dad actually supported your interest.
He did, but what everybody said about me was, she'll get married. I remember the pharmacist said to my dad, and my dad smoked all the time, and he had just brought me back from being the president of the Georgia Press Association, which was purely, just a fluke. They just proxied me into it from Sylvan Hills. So he was bringing me back from the trip to Athens, and we stopped at Dr. Guffin's drugstore, as usual, for him to get some cigarettes and probably me to have a Coke or something. And Dr. Guffin looked at me, and he said, yes, she's doing all this, but you know good and well she'll get married first thing. You'd be a miracle if she goes to college. So that was sort of a backhanded way of saying I was a pretty girl, a circular way. And I remember my dad, he had been talking to me all the way home, but all the way from there to my house, he smoked that cigarette and he didn't say anything. And I'm thinking, what is going through his head, that I think he virtually abandoned my career status at that point, although he never quit being totally supportive to me and a joy to talk to, you know. Of course, he was always joyous when I was happy and busy. And he tells me that from the time I was able to be, I was just totally intense in whatever I was doing. And if he even spoke to me, I jumped so hard, you know, that he would have to laugh and cry at the same time.
What about your mother? Was she as supportive?
My mother, yes. Oh, yes. She was dear. Neither one of them saw career advancement for me in art. And I'm just as glad they didn't, because I was untarnished when I got to be Bill's student, you know, with anything but the desire to paint. That was all. And so that was good, I thought, you know. But my mother was just supportive about everything. She was a very tender mother. I'm very fortunate. A really good mother. I would recommend her in the mothering department. But she would say things like, I sketched someone. I was up there not long before the end of her life. I sketched a picture of her and Daddy from a photograph, and she walked in, and at that point she had lost her memory, sort of. But when she saw that picture, she just said, she just suddenly reverted to how she used to be, and she just said, "Oh, Charlotte, that's just wonderful. That's just beautiful, you know." And that's what she'd always say. And another thing she'd say, which I always laugh, when I'd be doing a portrait or something, and she'd just stand behind me, she'd say, "Charlotte, don't touch it again." Because she knew how I was, you know, but I'd want to keep on and keep on.
So in school, you know, you've got your typewriter now, and you've got your easel. Were you like part of the school newspaper or anything?
Oh, definitely,
like that?
and that just saved my life. Because for whatever reason, I was not popular with my little girlfriends from the age of arriving in Atlanta to the 4th grade and smiling at every boy in the room, which is what you do, I thought. No, it's not what you do in the 5th grade, which is where I was, you know, soon. And so I caught a hard time, and the newspaper and writing for it's the first time I got respect, and then I could focus on them and put their pictures in the paper and have all this good times. And so I drew cartoons for it, and likenesses of everybody in the cartoons, and, you know, 1 or 2 or 3. You don't get to do that many. I think it was like a monthly newspaper. But we had it printed, and I would get on that bus and take that paper over to the printer once we got another printer. But we started out on Peoples Avenue in Atlanta, on West End, where Brown High School was. That was the printer. And we set type in lead rows and stacked it so it fit with my cartoon, which was on a plate, and with the few little ads we had from the local grocer and druggist and everything. That was so thrilling. Our whole little group, you know, of newspaper people went in, because the printer had to do it after hours, so it'd be dark and late. And we just had such fun. I mean, that was our fun way of being out late at night, you know.
Nice. And so what year was this in Atlanta?
I graduated from that high school in 52, so it was in 51, 50, and 49 that I was there. And I went back to my reunion with them. I don't know which it was. I think it was the 50th or something. But it still had that ambiance of just being the best folks you could be around, you know. We had a good cultural thing going then. That was sort of post-war, 49, 50, 51, too. It was just that wonderful, optimistic, prospering time, which everybody was prospering, you know. In our little block, Daddy had only gotten a FHA loan house on Erin Avenue in Atlanta because the Department of Agriculture qualified as important war work. So being a government employee qualified. So on the next wing, we had a nurse and her husband, and on the other side, a sailor and his wife. You know, it was typically all these people who had either been in the service or a nurse, or like my dad in the Department of Agriculture. So it was a good feeling, you know. It was a good surrounding.
So the character where you grew up, it sounds like you just got this kind of feeling of optimism. Maybe not. There's maybe not a scenic beauty kind of a thing, but you've got
it was
really fertile ground.
It was a thrilling thing because Atlanta was just moving, and we rode a city bus to school from Capitol when we had to go to Brown because there really wasn't a middle school. So we rode the city bus and had to have city tokens, and you just felt that vibrant sense of everything's growing and turning out well.
Yeah.
And you could go down to the Carnegie Library right behind Davison's on the city bus. Read your books, bring it back to the bus stop, read it, and the bus would pick you up. So yeah, make it sound, and of course it had its rough, scary edges, but we didn't know. We were happy.
So here you are, you're in high school and you've got this great thing going about the newspaper, school newspaper, and now you graduate and it comes time to think about college. Mm-hmm. Was it always understood that you were going to go to college?
Yes, it was by me and my mother and my daddy, I suppose. But I remember talking to Mary Garrison one time, not too long ago, was this go in here? And she said, well, we have our Wesleyan alumni meeting at her house, and that's how I happened to be there. And I said, I heard her say about going to Wesleyan, which is where I finally went on a scholarship. Well, my dad wouldn't have had me go anywhere else. And I thought, my dad didn't have any choices or even have any idea that he'd be paying boarding school tuition. And he, frankly, after I was there 2 years, told me that we had a perfectly good college right there in Atlanta at Georgia State. Right. And I was just glad he was honest with me. And he said, we don't need to be paying boarding school tuition for you to go to school. And by that time, I was dead up in love with Wesleyan, though. And I never lost the love of it because it was an all-girls school. Mm-hmm. And every girl's talent was important. Everything you did was given support. You didn't suffer from being several degrees below the football team and the cheerleaders, whom we adored. We all adored them. They were just young people like us. But a lot of other things did not get their attention except the newspaper. I really enjoyed that.
And in Wesleyan, was that a liberal arts college?
And mine was liberal arts. It started out as a conservatory in Macon for music students. And it was very prestigious as a conservatory. And then they went to liberal arts and built the Rivoli campus, the liberal arts campus that I was fortunate enough. My sisters and I, my sister Helen and I, worked at the Board of Education for a summer job one time. And they would contact churches. So we were a member of Capitol View Baptist Church. And they asked for, young high school students to come work at the board. So by working there, stapling papers for one of these men who worked in education, he knew that I wanted to go to college. And so when he saw a Wesleyan scholarship pop up, he called my home and told me to apply. And I did. And so it was all exciting. My little family had no idea, I was going to college. And it was great. It was a real exciting time for all of us.
Well, how about your sisters now? Did they show any kind of artistic inclination like you for writing?
My sister Helen was multi-talented too, but she was an athlete though. She was beautiful and she was an athlete. She was my first portrait subject because I just thought when she turned from a tomboy into a big blue-eyed pretty girl, I just kept trying to paint her to show that transition a little bit. So she had the talent for sports. She was on the basketball team and she got, everybody came to our yard to play backyard softball with Helen. And I completely stayed inside with my easel and my typewriter. And so we were totally different in that respect, although I just admired her extreme courage and prowess. Being a good athlete gives you lots of freedom and confidence. And so then Virginia I imagine she would have had some talent, but she didn't spend much time. She liked to play dolls and things. She was a good, like another generation younger than me, it seemed, even though we were all so close in age. So, I mean, I know that's all boring.
Well,
but anyway, I just get carried away.
okay. Well, how about anybody else in your kind of extended family? Were they kind of artistically?
Yeah, my father's nieces and nephews, they all had some kind of talent or ability and skill. They were all very able and intelligent. And my first cousin on my mother's side, when we used to draw, he actually got, his mama built him a desk for it and everything, because that was immediately if a boy showed some talent for it, there was career advancement in her mind, which is fine. I've gotten along fine both ways.
Well, here you are in Wesleyan. Did you have a career path, or were you?
Well, at Wesleyan,
what were your expectations?
At Wesleyan in liberal arts, I became an immediate English major because my first themes were read out loud in class, and I got assigned to the most challenging English teacher, and so that was fun. I was immediately successful that way and had a good time with it. And so it immediately put me in the English track, which I'd always been good at that in school. You get attention for whatever you'll put in with some skill. So between the newspaper and drawing for it, just drawing for pleasure, we took the English, the English was taken more quickly seriously,
And the instructors, were they all female, or were they?
You mean in what?
In your college?
Oh, no.
You had male?
We had male teachers and professors. In fact, Dr. Ginlat was a very distinguished English professor. And everybody was, devoted to him too, and it was great.
Well, I was going to ask you, but you're in a co-ed, you're in a
all-girls school.
So at this time there weren't any, there's no men in there, so there's nobody going to school on the GI Bill, which is very common in universities.
Yes, and at Florida State when I finally got there, and at Georgia State too, they were both there. But Mercer was nearby. And right away, they had mixers for us with boys from Mercer.
I see. And these were the guys going to school on the GI Bill.
Well, actually, not the man I married now. I don't know. No, by the time 53, they may have been still in school from the GI Bill.
That's true.
But what I met at Mercer were mostly people, which was just another thing I met at Wesleyan and Mercer. These wonderful small towns in Georgia when I thought Atlanta was all there was. It was big enough that you could think it was the whole state. But people came from these, I think of them as sort of little wonderful kingdoms in these small towns, where they knew everybody and they had to be prosperous to be sent off to school. So I got an education there. And
did you enjoy these college years a lot? Do you think you really grew a lot?
Oh, Wesleyan, those first 2 years, it was just wonderful. It was, yes, I grew a lot. Yes, the whole world opened up for me. Music, I'd never, classical music. You would have had to change to fine arts to do anything in arts, see. So I could not change from my liberal arts to, so I painted in my dorm room. I would paint and I would draw, and I painted for the freshman stunt, which was a big event every year. The classes competed. So that was how I did it. I just naturally kept on with the art. But the English was giving me the career, supposedly the career path.
Right. So were you going to be a teacher when you got out, maybe? Thinking something.
This was my only time to lie, cheat, and steal to get what I wanted. I wanted a literary education. So I persuaded my in-laws when I had 2 children and didn't know I was going to have a third immediately to help me go to school, to help, whatever way they could. And they actually had me registered at Valdosta State to come over there and stay with them and, let Wallace, my husband, visit us and so on. But then here comes little George, who's in the kitchen now. And so that ended that plan. So then I kept on with my mother-in-law until George was 3 years old, and they kept, I took him with me to Atlanta, but they kept the two older children who were 10 and 9, Bill and George. They were 10 and 8, and sent them to school in Quitman for 6 months while I finished up at Georgia State.
Well, when did you get married? How did you find your husband?
At Wesleyan, like I said, the Mercer boys came, 2 mixers, and we dated. And here I had come to Wesleyan really to escape the dating life and to escape the fate assigned to me by Dr. Guffin, which I was resisting with all my might and main, which was to marry without a college education. I was determined I wasn't going to do that. You know, as determined as you can be at 17 when the entire world is wonderful to you, you know.
Was that in your senior year? Or?
No, just the second year. I met him at the end of my freshman year, and we dated through my second year, and we decided to marry in 55 because he was in the Army for 2 years. So he had to go immediately there. And that slowed things down and gave me time to get a trousseau and all of that, and a wedding dress and everything.
Well, did you complete your 4-year degree at Wesleyan?
Not at Wesleyan. That was the end of that, and marriage looked like another big adventure at that time, you know. Yeah, thinking we were going to Fort Bragg to live, and we had a house, and he was an officer, and so it was equally, you know, adventurous looking at that point.
Well, so you went to Fort Bragg, and were you going to start a family right away? No,
we were not. We agreed on that we wanted to wait, you know, until we were settled into a good marriage and a good income. And this Army thing was really temporary for 2 years. And then he was going into his law practice, wherever that would be. And it turned out to be in Brunswick, Georgia, which was such a far cry from booming Atlanta. You know, it was sedate and feudalistic, I'll say. You know, everyone was a family. Had you been here long? And I've been here like almost 40 years now, and I'm glad I stayed. They are lovely families, and now I've got the 2 or 3 generations of family around me, and friends, and, you know, children of friends, of which you were one, which is wonderful.
Well, was your husband, was he in the legal branch of the Army?
Yes, they put him in JAG. We were there for a year in Fort Bragg, and that was just in the Quartermaster Corps. But and what they did was they sent the young men with their college mates with them. They sent them almost a whole culture that they were used to with them. So we had friends from Mercer in the Army. And so it was really good. At that point, America could afford to do everything a good way, you know.
And so he could, I suppose he was completing his 2-year requirement for
his 2 years.
Military requirement.
For the military, and meanwhile studied for the bar. He had to continue and pass the bar after he finished the service.
And he did. Where did he?
He went to Mercer for 3 years, and then he took some refresher courses at John Marshall in Atlanta. And so I got to see a little bit of him while he studied for that, but he really studied.
And so he joins a law firm.
It was
sent to Brunswick.
Mm-hmm. And at that time it was Bennett, Gilbert, and Whittle.
And so this would have been like
57 when we got here. We finished those 2 years in Atlanta.
And were you living in Brunswick? Did you live in Brunswick, or did you?
Yes, we lived in Brunswick for like 6 years. We rented the bottom floor of Mrs. Arabella Wilson's home on the corner of Egmont and Prince in Old Town, Brunswick. And that was rare. You had to have everybody ask about for you because they didn't have rental property except out in, I can't think of, Glencoe and that other part. I can't think. It sounds like a can't think. It sounds like a gas company. I don't know the name of it. Arco. Yeah, my little mind went searching for that word, and here it comes. Doesn't Arco sound like a filling station? A little bit.
I always thought it did, actually. So at this time, what are you doing while he's starting up his law practice? What are you doing?
Oh, I was decorating the house with my mother-in-law's help. She brought yards and yards of organdy curtains, which I just loved, and we just filled a wall with them, and she was so happy helping me do that. We had a wall full of organdy curtains with persimmon valances across, and little early American furniture, which was obtained in her family for cost, and we were just doing, the thing, and meeting everybody, and more people than I could do, because I still want to be a writer. One thing my professor had said to me, he said, well, it's good you could be a writer because that's something you can do at home. Once again, I was consigned to a prompt marriage as soon as possible. And it was, so he said, you can do it at home. So I thought that was like a promise, that I could write at home. So I would do my housework in the mornings, and I even got up at 6 o'clock in the morning and went in the kitchen. Cold as it was then in Brunswick, it would be cold. And bundled up in a blanket, and I wrote my first 2 short stories in that kitchen and sent them to Christian Home magazine. And so that was the sort of thing I did while he was practicing law and before we had any children, I think I wrote my first story after I had my first child, and my second story after I had my second child. So there was a little bit of we had that first child over on Egmont Street in 1957. In that apartment, it was the whole downstairs floor of a beautiful old home, and Mrs. Wilson had the whole upstairs and a garden, a vegetable garden out back, everything, the whole utilitarian 1919 sort of house, this wonderful little house.
Well, it wasn't very far for him to go to work.
No.
He could practically walk. We had a little Ford automobile. It was cute. It was that kind of modern Ford, two-tone green, and he drove that to work from Miss Wilson's, not that he needed to. So at this point, you do have training, obviously, to write, but you don't have any formal art training at this point.
None, except our high schools did teach us charcoal drawing, and that was my first impression. Was our 7th grade teacher would have them draw on the same big manila paper that Bill did, the big 18 by 24s, and there would be these charcoal drawings all around the ceilings when we came in, and just a pineapple. It was so gorgeous in charcoal. Because there's all this drama, the darks, just like Bill said, the darks and the lights. And there you are, you're looking at manila paper with black lines on it, which is absolutely gorgeous. And I guess that's part of the mark of it. I just knew those were gorgeous. I just knew. And then when I finally got here and Bill taught me how to do it, I used that pineapple drawing a lot of times, that difference in texture.
So you did have a few classes at least in art in high school.
Yes, I did. With my little paint set, I did an oil portrait of my art teacher, who was the second. Both my art teachers were women then. So,
well, you've certainly done a lot more than charcoal since then.
But nothing better. I adore charcoal still. Doing those drawing classes with your daddy, we did everything, and I just found out, you could do everything with charcoal.
Well, how about in your house there in Brunswick? Did you have an area set aside that you maybe,
could
did your writing and painting or anything?
I had that Remington noiseless portable my daddy had given me on a little table like that by the window, and you had to erase then, so I had a eraser and a pencil in it. And that's how I wrote my stories, same way with the others. There was no place for me to paint. I remember when I started taking Bill's lessons, I once painted the dishes drying in the kitchen rack, because I could, from my dining room table, little bitty rooms, I could see that, And it wasn't pitiful because, you're joyful about everything at that point. So there's some hard things that happen, which I won't go into, but I mean, you're having children and you have to look after them and you want everything for them in the way of health and welfare. So that day off to go to paint with Bill, I consider that just the perks, just the perks of life at that point.
What about your children at this time? They're young, but how did you manage to do both? Did you have babysitters that would come in, like if you wanted to go paint or anything?
Margaret Bennett, Mr. Bennett's wife, they had no children, and they were just a middle-aged couple, barely in their 40s or 50s, I guess. They lived in this very old house, which they had kept very like it'd been in the 20s. So it tended to make you think they were older than they were, which they weren't. They were a lovely pair. But she made it her mission to keep Bill and Wallace for me while I went to paint. And that was a form of really taking my going to art class seriously. Plus, I guess everybody had to see it did me a lot of good emotionally, that I was always so happy after I came home. And a lot of that really wasn't about succeeding at painting. It was about enjoying being there in the ambiance your father created, helped us all to have,
Well, how about your husband? What did he feel? What did he think about your career outside of being the wife and mother? How did he support that?
He was supportive, but he least liked the writing, the intense focus of the writing, I only did this once. I only once was at the typewriter when he came home. And after that, his disappointment at not finding me waiting. And he always came home cheerful, put his car keys down, glad to be home, through the day's work, ready to spend a little time with me or whatever. But I crossed that line only once, with the rest of the time I did it in the morning or whenever, And then I got the children and it was even more whenever. But, I was lucky. I was really lucky, and all that. And I didn't get so I painted prolifically until way later. You'd do one or two things and as your mom would say, now look, that one painting can't be your whole life, And I learned later, to just go on and paint. And of course, that's what I remember this. And I wanted to throw away my first painting, and your father would have none of that. He caught me on the way to the trash can with it, and he said, no, very kindly, but no, you spent a lot of time on this, and you will learn more from correcting what you dislike about that painting than you would have going to the next. Although, as you go on, you'll always have to leave a painting and go to the next one because you've done all you can on it. So I think I was a good scribe for him. I could remember almost everything he taught, and not only that, but the spirit of it, what he meant.
Looking back, you've been painting for an awful long time, and John, how do you see your art as maturing? What do you highlight?
If I'd known that I was going to have this much time to paint, I might not have stayed in it right then, but I am so glad I did, because I learned everything I need to learn from Bill. And then I went to Florida State, and really the studio courses, they were good ones, and they were mod, and they were into whatever was, up with all the art schools over the country. But I enjoyed the art history there more, because Bill had prepared me for the art history. And like him, I was certainly drawn to the era in which people really drew figuratively, painted figuratively. That to me was such an exciting era, and I did not really know that it was after the Renaissance and the Baroque era that they developed so much more in the drawing and depicting things as they were, sort of. So I loved the art history at Florida State, and I had been prepared for it with a whole vocabulary from Mitty and Bill's art lectures.
Well, let's talk about that. You returned to school to go to graduate school. Now, how did that come about? Tell me how you got there.
Well, you know that, and this is it. 22 years ago, and I cannot believe it because that was the highlight of my life after Bill. And Bill I sort of felt like I had graduated from Bill and gone to Florida State, you know. And once I got there, even though I was there as a teaching assistant in the English composition department, and I was getting a degree in English with a concentration in writing. It was the only writing program. They didn't have one at the University of Georgia. In this area, it was a 4-hour drive from here, and it was the only people who offered anything in the associated writing programs. So even though I was there in language, I was so accustomed to having art to express myself in that I just kept going. And Bill would have enjoyed this. I don't know if I ever told him. But I was having to teach 2 classes a week, grade all their papers. It amounted to 35,000 words of freshman English graded every 10 days. So you had this cross of papers on your shoulders all the time. But I had to draw and paint, you know. And then I had to look nice to go to class. I thought, you know, I was 48, and I heard them tell that they had mistakenly taken me for younger when they gave me the position. You know, when they let me fill out the forms, I just went to a motel room, filled out everything, took it back, and they mailed it. And I got the position. But you know, you're in these much younger people, so I was trying to look nice. And I slammed those doors on the drawers on the bureaus every night, getting frantically dressed. One day, the girl from downstairs came up and said she needed to have a word with me. And she said, "You stay up so late, and you don't go to bed till midnight, and then you start with the bureau drawers." And she said, "We can't sleep." I just apologized abjectly. I was just shocked. And here's what I did for her. I had carried a 4x6 piece of plywood upstairs for my easel. 4x6 piece of plywood, practically the whole wall, and I had put banner paper over it because Bill had me drawing large when I left there. And so I had a piece of banner paper on there, and I said, "I tell you what, I will do your portrait in charcoal right now if you'll lie down on that sofa and just give me the blue jeans and the look, you know." And she did, and I drew this lovely, big, long drawing of her cute little self in her blue jeans. And she took it downstairs, and we made up, and I never shut the bureau doors after midnight again. You can bet that. Those clothes were laid out before I did all the paper grading, you know, and I tiptoed around. But I was so glad, and I had in my book I wrote about how those 2 girls were such a help to me.
Did you attend classes yourself, though?
Oh, yes. I had to take 2 writing classes, and they were 3 hours long. One was at night, and you had to just say, "In 2 weeks, I'll have a short story." And I thought short story meant 3,000 words, so I wrote 25-page short stories and had them photocopied and in the teacher's box by the date, you know, and you had to have them at the library because your peers read them in the library and wrote you a critique. And then you read them, they were read aloud in class, and so on. It was a wonderful experience, just wonderful. Both ways. Just think what a joy. I was in the candy store because I was teaching English, and see, for your syllabus teaching English, I got to read all the short stories I'd ever missed. You know, and teach them and talk about them. It was just so thrilling. And the best part of it, I was upstairs with 7 other teaching assistants, and boy, did we bond. You know, we all belonged to this little 55-strong group of people who carried that paper grading burden for the whole English department, practically. So it was just a joy, you know. I was in the briar patch and walking into a slideshow just like Bill's, except he had 2 projectors so you could compare. And for me, comparing images was just the unlock of understanding how people painted and why they were different in different eras. And then when we had the exam, you had to sit there and identify by date, artist, period, and description why you thought this slide was a certain thing. You may not have ever seen the slide before.
So you were, what about your...
Can you imagine how joyful that was at the age of 48?
But why did you feel like you just had to go back? I mean, this is a disruption of your life.
At that point, we had 3 sons in college, and my feeling was, at last, they are grown and they're out on their own. And, the big deal is you've got an empty nest. You're not needed anymore. And I thought, when I got my in-laws to help me go to college and overcome Wallace's understandable opposition, when I said I was cheat, lying, and stealing, I wanted one thing, a literary education. I knew I could paint on my own, but I wanted a literary education. And if I had to say I was going to teach English to get it, I would take whatever way they would give me a literary education, and that was the only way. I took the English teaching late decision, so-called, at 32 when I took Georgia State to get that first degree. See, I didn't stop with that first degree. As soon as I got that first degree, that master's degree loomed up, just like they say.
So you felt like you really needed something more complete.
I had formed my dream as a teenager that I would not let marriage wipe out my chance of learning things. Why should it? Wouldn't people rather have a smart mother? Actually, a counselor told me that it's preferable if the mother, while she's mothering, just functions as about 3/4 of her abilities. Well, thank you very much.
Well, in that era, it was really kind of an expectation that women would get married. If they went to a 4-year college.
You had to make a choice. If you married, you were marrying to stay married and retire to raising that family.
And you found your husband in college, which was a large reason for going to college. You'd want to get a man who was professional.
Exactly. I wanted somebody intellectual, that I thought would go along with all this. And so fortunately his family did. His mother was a school teacher, and his father was a judge, and his father was even more sympathetic than his mother because he'd had to give up Emory University to go home when times were hard. So he was a dear about the whole thing.
Well, how would you describe your approach to art if you were talking like to an art peer, let's say? What will be your
I don't know, because
of art?
Bill started this group that I belong to, the Georgia Coastal Artists. He started it because he and Mitty had personally mounted all these beautiful exhibits for us as each one came along wanting them. And they just couldn't keep doing that and teach all his classes, and he was teaching at the college. So he said, you should get a group together and mount your own exhibits, And so we did, but what I'm saying is, as that group has grown and included more and more people, one conversation we just stop short and don't let him, is what is art? What are your art? What is art? We just, no way, nobody's going to stand up and preach, on what is art. So I would have a hard time describing my art, because I did in the paper recently, I called it both classical and personal. Because I noticed in Bill's interview in Ebb Tide that he said that he was trained as a classical art teacher, that he taught the traditional methods. Mainly because that's the only thing that can be taught. If someone's going to do an abstract and splash paint all over, which he tolerated that. He had Beth Engel was a wonderful abstractionist. And then she went to these 2 paintings, which are hers, And she did beautiful oil quality. If you turn the light on that, it's just beautiful. And Bill had her sitting there with the brush that eventually wore off the ends because she would paint over and over to get this wonderful texture. And see, we all responded to anything that was this aesthetic pleasure of art that starts with what's the quality of the paint you're laying down. Bill would tell us, there's a paint quality. It's going to show. How did you use your brush? And your brush can be used like she did. I bought that for $350 and the other one like it when she was showing them at one of our shows when I could afford it. and it's, to me worth much more. They're always worth much more than you could sell them for. And I love it. But that's, do you see, if you had the privilege, and see, for me it was only 3 hours a week, 9 to 12 on Tuesdays. But then he gave those lectures, and then he expanded to the afternoon charcoal drawing classes, which were extensive. And I was there for most of those. Am I getting way too far off? I just get so excited because it's hard to tell what kind of painter I am, except that it's like the Baroque in that you love the paint quality and you make that paint, you cooperate with it. You don't try to make it do something that it wasn't made to do. And he had me doing a lot of watercolor. And I loved it, but there's a place in watercolor where you have to stop. I don't want to stop. So I went to acrylic so I could paint over it and splash around in them. And that Maryland painting was my sampler of acrylic, how I could do every color, what it would be like and everything. And I spent 3 months in Bill's studio out at the college. When it was empty in the afternoon, I could paint while I was teaching art history with him and taking his classes and everything.
Well, let's just say that you meet a stranger, a total stranger, which at this point in your life is probably hard to do, but and they ask you, what do you do? How would you respond to that? Would you say you're an artist, or would you say you're a writer? They say, Charlotte, well, what do you do?
Okay, all my cards are made up. I call myself a story artist because my paintings have a narrative thread through them as I've developed my own style in late. And it's hard to stick to. Once you say, this is my style, you're having to interpret everything this way so people will recognize it. But I met another artist, Peggy. Oh gosh, now I know her name as well as anything in it. My little brain will bring it to me in a minute. Peggy Everett, I think. Yes. How could I forget? I did an article on her. And she's doing these beautiful sort of Hudson School marsh scenes here. And I went to interview her. Her whole living room on Hamilton Landing, in Hamilton Landing, she has a house in Hamilton Landing that is just all studio. And you walk in and she has an easel that will slide left and right with this huge canvas, go anywhere she wants it to, up, down, left, right. And the paint is everywhere, and she's painting in oils gorgeously. And she has over here her studies stacked, which she sells, little studies she's made out in the marshes. People buy them. They know she's the authentic, fully developed artist painting beautifully in this style. But she told me versatility is one of her things. She paints for about 6 different galleries. And in the West, they want her horse studies, which are nothing like the Hudson River, beautiful, expansive landscapes. And somewhere else, they want another thing from her. And suddenly, I'm meeting a versatile artist who's more than competent in each area she does. But she doesn't have to stick to the one style. So even at my age, I hold out hopes that I'll get to complete my family series, which has become a very recognizable style. I think the most typical one of that is Across the Room, but you may want to look at the paintings later.
I'm hoping that we'll be able to go around and you can talk about this.
Okay, good. Well, that's what I'm saying. I hold out hope that I can develop everything I can. And I've had such good support, as you see, especially from your mother and daddy, who were like, to me, like life coaches as well as arts teachers.
Well, speaking of this, at what point did you decide that you had the title of artist, that you could actually say you were an artist?
One day sitting in Bill's class, I had been painting as a student, and I loved the protective feeling of being a student. But I thought to myself, it's time to just go ahead and say you're whatever people think artist is, because that means that you're taking up the responsibility to keep going past the hard part. And there are hard parts. And I took great pride in going past the hard part. You know, just keeping on going past those places where you want to walk out because the model doesn't suit you today. Or you're tired and you want to go lie down in that sofa Mitty had in the big gallery. I could go lie down in there and put my head on a pillow because I couldn't keep up with the drawing that day. After all, I had little children, a family, all that stuff. Sometimes I was tired when I got there. But where did I ramble off with that? It was about having a style.
Well, it's about you decide you were an artist.
Yes, and I can remember. I was sitting in that class, and I'd been painting for years with Bill. I was sitting in a class, enjoying. He had told me to take this filbert brush and do this whole still life of sweet potatoes and things with a filbert brush and put that little texture that way. And I was sitting there doing that, and I was thinking, I have to go ahead and say I'm an artist. You know, I have to say it to myself and go ahead and take all this joy and the problem of controlling it and doing something with it.
So you can actually pinpoint a moment in time. Absolutely.
Because otherwise, everybody in there stayed student. They sort of played, oh, this is a class and all us girls are taking it together. And I'm going, no, indeed. You know, this is not... I've been in those kind of classes. I loved them. I loved having the girlfriends, the free love like it is, because everybody is nice to everybody regardless. That was at Wesleyan. But when it came to painting with Bill, the only way I could do it was to focus like I had as a child, intently. Excuse me, we're not doing do-gooding today. We get to develop a skill here, and I'm going to do it. And also we get to respond to everything that's in us with the paint and all the joy there is. And I'm going to do that. And I'll tell you, if you're running out of tape, I might save this story.
Well, I think we
need to take a break.
Tape, so we'll pause at this moment and pick this back up because this is very interesting.
Okay.
So we're going to pause right here.
All right.
We ran out of tape on the last one.
Sit down.
And we just got a couple more questions here. We'll get into the Art Center.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you, Charlotte, in a room here, which we're going to look at in a little while, full of your paintings. I wanted to ask you, do you find that you want to keep all your paintings, or do you like to sell them?
Actually, most of these paintings, you know, it would be very hard to part with because I painted them very autobiographically, except for when I did my movie stars. You know, I had movie stars, and that was a little outside the family thing. It was really the 40s movie stars. When I went to Florida State and took art history, the teacher, I can't remember his name, but he did a special thing on Hogarth, on William Hogarth, and William Hogarth actually invented the kind of lithograph prints of paintings that enabled artists to keep their original work. And it was really important because he said, you know, the painters, a work of art, it takes so much longer, and when you've sold it, you sow months and months of, you know, work and preparation and everything. And he said they could popularize these images with the prints, and people would go to a fine print shop and buy them and things. And he invented that. He developed that for the artists, and that's one thing. Now that there are G-clay prints where you have a good photographer take it and print it on acid-proof paper, and usually, typically for me, it'd be watercolor paper because that'd be what I painted on. That's what I hold out hope of being able to do, because if I'm painting, these family pictures are images from my memory. I mean, there was nothing to look at. They're totally from memory. So I could hardly just say, be happy, say, here, take this for this amount of money. Doesn't quite work out, right? I'm trying now to paint, or it's not hard to do, paint the beach scenes and things that people like. That's great fun. And so I'm doing that because, of course, if you go to the professional level, you've got to be ready to sell. You've got to paint some paintings which you are willing to sell, that you more or less present almost like an illustration or something, you know. So,
do you think that your artwork then is going to be your most kind of important legacy that you'll leave behind, or if
you
the
know,
writing would be?
Isn't that funny? I kind of concern myself with that. I hope that I would like these family pictures to get a sort of genre recognition, you know, as genre paintings. Because I have read that if you are not recognized for your work while you're alive, it does not increase after you die, typically. Emily Dickinson in literature being an exception, but she was recognized and wanted more recognition, her biographers tell us now. But so that's the way I feel about selling paintings, sort of ambivalent. I would like to be versatile and more prolific. And I admire Peggy Everett for her idea of versatility. It's just a new thing to hear of. It's been maybe too prevalent for people to think, well, if you don't interpret everything one way, you are not a serious or accomplished artist, professional. So for one thing, a lot of people that painted with Bill would take any subject and any approach and say, let's make this look right. That's sort of typical the way you learn, you know. Paint it the way you want to and then make it appealing. Make the viewer's eye follow through the painting, make it a satisfying work. So that's what we did, and we didn't confine ourselves to, you know, just what people wanted to see. We really used it to explore both the outer world and the inner world, you know, that comes out.
Well, that's a really good segue into this kind of last question about your personal history. Do you think your art was kind of more of a personal journey rather than an attempt to add to like textbook art or anything? I think it was, or is continuing, I guess, to be a personal journey.
Actually, it really is a personal journey, but it isn't meant to be a hobby. You know what I mean? It's been pursued and paid for in so many ways because you take time that you could be spending otherwise and you invest it in painting and learning to paint and in having paintings that tell a story. I'd be of the type that says in both the writing and the painting, the personal is the important. You know, the personal is what's widespread. It is what reaches people because everybody's a person, you know. So how's that? Is that a good question?
That's a good
That's
answer.
right. There won't be a quiz, will there?
There's no quiz.
Oh, great. I can't be right or wrong.
Well, now we're going to shift gears a little bit here and talk about what you remember about the Art Center and the history of the Art Center as you remember. I'd like to ask you, the first question is, when did you first become involved with the Art Center?
It was, I think, in 1957, maybe after I had my first child. Harriet Gilbert took me over to go to art class with her. And I think we started in cold weather, so we sort of had bad attendance for a while because we would get up, I'd get up in that old cold house on Egmont Street, and I didn't know if I wanted to even get out of the house, but we would go. And then the class was from 9 till 12, and Bill was teaching, and he was pretty young then. He was like maybe in his 40s or something. And everybody had sort of a semi-crush on him, that was allowed.
Well, what were your first impressions if you recall your first time you went in the building? Do you have any kind of impressions or expectations of what it was?
Well, if you talk about going first time I went into the building, back then, you just went straight to the classroom. So what I experienced most then was the classroom, the concrete floor, the fact that if you flipped a little watercolor on the concrete floor, it didn't matter. While in the meantime, we were keeping these little 1950s housewife homes, where it was just so, they had raised the homemaking standards to go with all the appliances that supposedly did it for you, which has never happened. But they do some wonderful things, like doing the laundry for you is great. But we're keeping these perfectionist households, so it was just great to go somewhere where you could paint, and if you drop the paint, you'd drop it for entertainment even, because it was such a break.
Well, how many, you say you went to your first class was a 3-hour class. Mm-hmm. Who was in these classes with you then?
Well, there was Harriet Gilbert, and there was Annie Lee Taylor, who, she was Mrs. Wilson's daughter, actually. And she would come over, and, if anything needed help fixing or anything, Annie Lee would come fix it, because that was her childhood home, And Annie Lee and Harriet would take me to lunch at the airport, where they had a little lunch bar then, and we'd go have a sandwich. And that would extend our outing by about an hour, and then we'd go home. And most days, Margaret Bennett kept the children for me to go. And she had a little canister of cinnamon grams for them and things like that, So.
Well, did Harriet Gilbert, was she the wife of one of your husband's?
Yes, she was James Gilbert's wife. And eventually, Dorothy Gilbert, who was John's wife, she came to class. I don't remember if they came together, but I remember her being there so much longer than Harriet was a regular there. But these people painted too. Harriet and Betty Lowe and Annie Lee and a number of other people were good friends, and they even had a little gallery over there in what was West Gables or something, that little building across from what used to be the post office. And
so yeah,
they had a show and exhibited their paintings. I remember as far as an impression of the building and everything, more of that was later because they added the larger gallery. And then they had exhibits, and so we saw more of the front galleries. I think Mitty sort of activated them some. And then we'd often get there and we wouldn't have the paint we wanted, and so Mitty would stock a little bit of paint and a few little brushes for us. And strictly as a convenience to keep the class going. And I know I was a big shopper in there because I was always wanting a bigger brush, as Bill demanded, and I was always in there getting something because that was a candy store,
And at that time there wasn't very many things around the art center.
No, it was just the big parking lot, and right next door it used to be Lyle, I forget his name, but Bill was big friends with him, and he'd always say, "Do you want coffee?" and he'd go over there and get it, and I would have a little patience with that because he would say, "Does anybody want coffee?" oh, okay, how do you take yours? And I'm like, Bill, surely not. You're not going to get everybody's coffee order and go over there. And we want you over here, you know.
Well, I do know he did hit that convenience store quite a bit. Every little thing. And what other kinds of things were you doing at this time? You were taking classes, but were you involved in any other kind of activities in the community?
Lots more than I wanted. I would have been happier staying at home with the children when I was not out painting or having something I really wanted to do. But in Brunswick, and I think I was still living in Brunswick then, people were just felt that they were so kind to include you in everything. And they didn't know about these already reclusive as a writer, and trying to find time to get to art class, which turned out to be something you'd never thought would be so much fun, you know, and sociable and warm and all that good stuff. And so, and when I had to go out and go socialize, people were so kind, and once I was there, of course I had a good time, but I always was trying to save a whole day to write in, and then half a day to paint in, and you know, both activities made me very happy. But like I said in that little piece, I started reading deeply religious things and whatever, and thinking, how do I do this? How do I manage these precious children and do two talents which are so joyful? And I read Kierkegaard saying, you know, you've got to put the ethical before the aesthetic. And I decided I'd always have an ethical faith, and that would give me the balance to get it all in order. And apparently it worked, because I have got writings all over the house, you know, they're in filing cabinets and everything. Not good at selling or publishing, apparently, and I've got to work on that. But it's worked. It's given me a balance that I could hold on to, you know, and feel the promise that if there's something good and joyful for me to do, time will be provided, you know.
It's a good philosophy.
Yeah.
Well, how did you see that the Art Center could, we'll put that a different way. What did the Art Center offer that would fit into your goals at that time? And I guess really what this means is you're there taking art classes.
Mm-hmm. Well, your father was a Pisces, and he reminded me of my mother, because his extreme talent was just toleration for whatever you were doing. And I don't know how he stood it, because when I teach art, if they won't do what I'm showing them how to do, I hurt all over. You know, I mean, you got to do it this way, and they're just, and this is with little kids, and they'll just go everywhere far of the mark, and you can take no pleasure in what they're doing. That's the way I feel about it. And with Bill, bless him, is that still working? When people were doing abstracts, when Bethinger was mixing mediums that really didn't mix, you know, on a canvas on the floor, when I was being a little nutty and set up 2 easels to do a watercolor on so I didn't have to slant it. So he must have made a lot of sacrifice to allow everybody to just do what they wanted to. And it is really funny that there he was with all his I mean, you know, if I was drawing a figure, he could come up by me and he would say, now the shoulder would be up because of the pressure. You got them with their elbow up or whatever, leaning on the elbow, or this or that anatomical thing. And I would just think, oh, that's so marvelous. We do have bodies. You know, we tend to forget that, us literary people or whatever. And so it was very healthy. To me, it was very healthy. The whole thing reminded you of all of yourself. You know, it was very good for me. And what do you talk? What was your question about his teaching, or?
Well, I was going to see what the Art Center might offer you personally as far as achieving what your goals were at that time.
Well, I did not know until I got in there that I call it an ordinary talent for art. A lot of people draw at my level, but they don't necessarily pursue it or get encouraged to. And so that's what I found there, was that I had enough talent to keep going and enjoy it and make something out of it. So that's what the Art Center did for me. And plus, oh goodness, it was just like a haven, for those, people, they came because they just felt welcome. They walk in and the studio was empty, Mitty was there, and and there was always an exhibit. The gallery would have something interesting in the front. There was a little jewelry and cards in the back. So, but I'm not sure. I tend to think it's just self-evident what the Art Center did for us. It just it was both things. He had the background and, of course, the extreme talent and skill in teaching traditional drawing and approaching traditional drawing from so many ways. But then somehow he managed, we'd all get so excited about it that maybe we went off in 2 or 3 wrong directions. But he would just see us through that,
Well, did you get a sense of philosophy that I guess, associated with the Art Center, what it was about? Was there any philosophy that you felt when you attended these classes?
Actually, it was all about Bill, because you don't find the Art Center was organized around a personality and people's response to that personality, and that carries so much. On the one hand, he wanted us to know all these wonderful art history terms and not be afraid of the Italian names and the German names and the whatever, which he fluently said, and told us. And of course, to teach the lectures that he did with the slides, that took great preparation, arranging those slides. People tend to not be patient when slides are slow. And so he would have to arrange them all perfectly and then review the data, because he couldn't just go on what his response was to each one,
Well, it did take a lot of preparation.
Mm-hmm.
I saw many, many, many hours on those.
Going through those slides,
yes,
and getting them placed and everything.
Well, who other than Bill Hendrix worked there? Was there a staff, kind of a regular staff?
No, actually, for the longest time, it was Bill and Mitty, and once in a while a little assistant, someone who either volunteered or, and there was just that little bitty office, and of course the little kitchen, which was never meant to be used as much as it was used, and then the gallery, and then the big classroom, and I think Mitty added the pottery studio out back, and pottery classes, and the kiln. But I wasn't interested in that. I just wanted a place to paint. I figured I had to do one thing.
Wasn't there a framer? There was a framer.
Oh, we're back on. Yeah. Helen Strom.
Right.
And his name was Strom, Gene Strom.
Gene Strom, oh, right.
And he ran a little frame shop there at the back of the thing, which Bill had encouraged him to do. And so...
Was he there a lot, or just...
Yeah, he seemed to be there almost every time we finished a painting. He would...
That was convenient, I bet.
Yeah.
For everyone.
Yeah, it was.
And how about any other instructors? Who was teaching? There must have been other instructors.
Well, Amy Repin taught, but that was later on. He just got so somebody needed to run a beginner's class or a, continuing class or something. So I do remember Amy Reed, because she was a stalwart, worked all the time, taught a class, helped anyway. When I had my movie star exhibit, she was so nice that she went and got me some supper, because I was up on a ladder mounting clouds and stars on the ceiling in styrofoam.
Was she an artist in her own
Yes,
right?
she was an artist too. And she was in Ben's classes. She took most of his life classes with us, and they were a good-sized class too.
And Ben, he was an instructor.
Yeah, Ben came over and taught a Saturday life class for a good while, but the rest of the time he'd come over and paint with Bill in Bill's class with the rest of us.
Well, how about at that time, were there any other places in the community that you could take art classes that you could remember?
I didn't remember any. I didn't remember, all I knew was the Island Art Center, but I didn't remember any. I'm sure later people took them up, and there may have been some going on, but...
So, to your knowledge, it was kind of the first one.
Oh, definitely that. And he used to tell us, sort of laugh about, well, he did that in the Ebb Tide interview, where he talked about when he had him in the barrack, the BOQ, the officers' quarters, and how spoiled the artists were because they would just come and not paint even. This was not his students. This was when he tried to foster some artists.
So these, who were the kinds of people then that were in your classes? Were they professionals, or were they mostly people of leisure? Or?
Well, they were mostly people who either had the leisure to study a little art while they were, like Harriet and Dot were both attorneys' wives, and so was I, but I was way at the other end of the, economic spectrum there. But anyway, and Lucille and Quayle Walker, he was president of the first Glynn Art Association group, and they all got together and formed that to support the Art Center. And, I remember Bill did a watercolor portrait demonstration of Harriet Gilbert to that whole group, which was all their friends and people who were invited to come, and I was there. And I was just totally fascinated with what Bill was painting Harriet, who was, just quite a lady, just a very generous and very attractive person and personality. And I was watching that painting, and Harriet said, "Charlotte, I thought you were going to stare a hole through me while he painted that watercolor."
This was a demonstration to try and
it was before
get sponsors for
it was just actually they already had them. I mean, Glynn Art Association was thriving, so what it was sort of a meeting of the association that people were invited to come and see a demonstration, and they didn't do a business meeting. It was just a nice thing. There was a lot of that to, promote the arts. And oh goodness, I can see myself crossing that road in front of the airport with all the headlights going at night, going into the Art Center for something very festive and much trusted to be a delightful evening, all kinds of occasions like that. And people just, centered around them, lots of social life.
Well, speaking of that, how would the Glynn Art Association kind of send out that message in the community that these things were available? How did they advertise, and who was targeted, I guess, for that? Or do you know any about
way back then? I wrote some publicity for them. When there was a show, I'd write some publicity, and that was when you had to type something and type 4 pages, and you get one sentence wrong, you got to type it all over. And so it was a real big deal to see my articles in the paper about the Art Center, And Bill was so cute, he'd say, "Make them think they got an alligator tied down over here or something. We got to get them in here some way." But then after that, your mother developed the printing press thing, and she just sent out plentiful newsletters and notices and invitations and all of that. But it sort of, there was a lot of support. There was a lot of, and I didn't know everybody in that circle of people who developed the Glynn Art. I was just, newcomer and really enjoying it back then. And I enjoyed it. I continued to, like I said. So Just cue me in, get me on, get me on another track.
Well, who were the artists? Were they? I know there weren't many male artists. Were
No, hardly anybody, which was okay with us because mostly they didn't have time. I talked to one who said he had a closet full of drawings and life studies, but once he took a job, he didn't have time to do art anymore.
But wasn't there a Monday night class?
Yes, there was a Monday night class, and that's where people like Jim Ellison, people who had a day job, could come at night, and they did. I only went to that a couple of times because your class tended to be your little social group. You tended to feel at home there the time you were expected to be there. So that just happens that way. But I did take advantage of Monday classes when I had to paint for an exhibit.
Well, since you just said that the men probably had jobs and they really didn't have the time to develop any kind of a secondary interest or maybe a primary interest. They just had to have a day job.
Right.
So they didn't have time. But do you think that art was then, at least on St. Simon's or in this area, maybe been thought of as kind of a female pastime? Or
there were things like the Beaux-Arts Ball. I forgot who did that, or who sponsored it, but it was over on Jekyll Island, and it was the 70s. And 70s art was more or less masculinized, a good bit. I don't know why, but I don't know why.
So you think the 70s art was masculine? That's interesting.
Yeah, because, for instance, I've watched videos of Helen von Wyck, who paints in oils with a palette held the traditional way, doing the things. And of course, she studied with a man, but things were being done like, it doesn't matter what you use for a palette. Put a piece of glass down here and put the paint around it, and do this, and just don't be picky, don't be detailed, don't do those sorts of things, which women tended to be able to do, and. So there was that feeling that art was about strength and expression and, a lot of things like that. But Bill sort of modified that, even if the class was all women, you knew not to paint like you were knitting. He wasn't fond of flowers because he said God had already made them beautiful, and he would rather us take 3 bottles and make a reason for people to look at them, which we did. As it happens, wine bottles are quite pretty in different colors. I took 3 Coke bottles, empty liter bottles, and tried them on my Magnolia Manor, and they didn't get it, so I had to paint it for them and show them that you could make them beautiful, because that's what we learned to do.
Well, do you think that translated over to the medium then, like pastels might be feminine, just say, or art oils might be masculine? No?
I never had that division come to my attention. It was obvious that Bill was a man, but he, what am I trying to say? We just didn't do that. It wasn't a problem. I find that more in literature, more in English. In literature, you find more of a division, But, and when I went to Florida State, there was more of this, let's break some glass and paste it on a canvas, let's make little sugar lumps and stick Q-tips in them or whatever, and post a poem over it. It was, and you can't call that masculine or feminine, It was political is what I call it. Political. And saying break all the rules, you're on this, whatever, side of the barricades. Does that make any sense?
It does make sense.
You have to be careful asking me a question.
No,
I'll make up an answer.
Well, that's what we're here for.
Okay.
We're getting back to the Art Center, and the population at that time was very small in this area. How do you think that it could even be viable? How do you think that it could have even struggled or lived in such a small, sparsely populated area.
Yeah.
You know, do you see any reasons for that?
Well, I know that anybody and everybody who had anything to do with it became immediately loyal to it, and stayed there and either volunteered and painted or volunteered and didn't paint, or gosh, when you had your show, the volunteers showed up with wonderful food, you know, just ready to be part of it. It's like I said, you had Bill's personality, which everybody enjoyed, and I had him on this tape, and he'd make these little jokes and jibes that would just disarm everybody. And I liked that. You had on the one hand the skill and the knowledge and the depth of work in it, and then on the other hand this little joking way that said, now let's don't get too serious here, you know, let's don't think too much of ourselves or whatever, you know.
Well, the Art Center was built in 1956, and it was built to, I guess, house the activities of Glynn Art Association. So there really was two kind of separate, you know, you have the structure, the building, and then you have the association itself. Did you ever think that they were kind of one and the same, or was there ever anything in your mind that's I guess that marked that they were two separate entities?
You know, they functioned so, you know, functioned for so long without my feeling any particular pain in the division there. I know Mitty, she worked so hard to try to get us to function like a board, or, you know, and she'd give us folders with everything in there, our name and everything we needed. And of course, she finally said if she had a volunteer, please don't let it be an artist or an employer, because we were otherwise occupied, no matter what we were doing. We were otherwise occupied in looking for time to paint and thinking about what we were going to paint. And that's all, you know, I mean, and then we looked at everything, well, but my time is already short, you know, how am I going to paint if I do thus and so?
You had your priorities.
Yeah, we had to have them, you know, we just had to have them. So, but she did, you know, she did work with that. She worked with boards. She worked with all kinds of different things. And, you know, I'm afraid I'm typical in that I would just zone out when it came time to talk about the heating bill or the board or whatever. And poor Mitty, she had to do that, you know, had to see about all of that and keep it going. And she did for so long.
Well, let's talk about one of your classes there. Can you take us through a typical class? Like what would you do in these 3 hours? You'd show up with all your stuff and then you'd set up. And how would the class be conducted then after that?
Well, one of the things about showing up is you usually had your painting from last week or 2 or 3 paintings from 3 or 4 weeks. So when you laid out your paintings, we did a little informal review and everybody exclaimed over each other's paintings, which we considered totally, you know, appropriate, because usually we were just amazed that any of us had produced a painting, this, that, or the other painting, you know. And usually we'd been quarreling with a painting, you know, and not sure we liked it at all. And that's when I discovered that as an artist, you really are a social human being. And if you don't get support or, you know, any response to your paintings, you're not encouraged as much as you need to be. Or they couldn't discourage me, but you know what I mean. A little praise would make me feel a lot better toward my painting. You know, someone nice saying something that they liked it was just fine. So that's what we'd do. We'd have an informal, just happenstance of catching up with each other. And then once we were all set up, Bill would come up to the front of the room and he would deal with some small area of what we could do. And he said, and he would always make the joke that if you all ever listened to me and actually did what I told you, I wouldn't have any more classes. he always made that joke, and it was so true, because there would be people that would set up their paintings and everything, and they would just kind of, phone in listening to what he said, even though they adored him. They would sit there, but, now I don't mean that they didn't respect what he had to tell us. You know what they were waiting for? Is once you got to painting, the next part of his lesson was to come around one-on-one, and whether other people were watching or not, he would say, "May I sit here, at your painting?" After he gave you a couple of tips, and if you ask a question he couldn't answer just verbally, he would say, "Well, is it all right if I sit here a minute?" And then he'd sit down, pull his cuffs back, and sort of, "Anybody got some paint? Has anybody got a brush I could borrow?" "Oh, that looks like a good, thank you very much." And he'd puddle around in the watercolor and come up with some mixture, if it was watercolor. I don't think he did that as readily with watercolor as he did with oil, because, you could wipe it off if it didn't work. It always worked. And he would add some little detail. He said, "Don't you want to do just a little bit like this, and it would be this little stroke, that we just loved. I mean, if there was a duck on the pond, he would put that streak that might have followed it through the water, And that was great fun for us. And that was the class, because there'd be as many as 13 people there, 14. And he would have 14 one-on-one conferences with possible additions or corrections to your painting, which is the way I learned to paint. I mean, he would take something I had done and just make the slightest change to show you that it's all about changing it. You do it, it isn't set in stone, you move it, you change it, you make the slightest, and it makes it better.
So you had these paintings that you brought from home, or would you do anything there? Would you have any
not me.
No.
And I think I was pretty typical.
Oh.
You didn't pretty much paint at home. For instance, there wasn't any place to paint then we were in a very small house on Jekyll Avenue, and typically we kept the freshness of the painting going. We'd probably have it propped somewhere and look at it all week.
Oh.
So we would by then have thoroughly discouraged ourselves, and then when we got there and everybody liked them, we went back to work. But that was the way. That was a class day. And after he taught us, he'd go get some coffee, and he would offer to bring people coffee, or I'd go get some or whatever, and everybody settled in for their one-on-one. And they were quite territorial about these one-on-ones, and you can't blame them, "Bill, you missed me."
Was there any class that, I don't know, was there any, something memorable that happened during any of your class that you can think of? That
You mean
out of the ordinary?
out of the ordinary?
Yeah. That you just particularly remember from one of these classes? Or was it pretty much all?
No,
forward?
Okay. I was going to tell you that story where I was saying that I personally took on this focus that said, I have a right to focus here. We can shut out Bridge Club. Don't tell me someone's ill. Don't tell me, any of those things they require women to do. Now, there's that thing where we got to appropriate being taken seriously as artists, taking art as something worth doing. That's a gender thing, whereas not that anybody said, don't be artist. They said, women got this message, this is a bad world and it's up to you to change it for the sake of your children. Go visit all the sick, be in every bake sale. Every bad thing that happens, your turn to grieve. That's how quote, leisured women had to do. You've either got to be playing bridge, escaping all these things, or going to garden club, or, and garden club met in the afternoon after art class. Lots of times you had to change out of your grubbies and go to garden club. And I just made this ferocious focus that I was not going to let that interfere, and that it was this atmosphere that the Art Center deliberately wanted to make art making ordinary and carry an ordinary. We didn't want drama. You know what I mean? We didn't want drama, the super excitement of this or that. I remember Lee, what's her name, and Beth Engel were going to have a big exhibit. They were going to join one in Atlanta, and they crated up their paintings either in the middle of class or out in the gallery or whatever. That was as much drama as I needed, you know. I'll tell you, one time, I should say this with a degree of chagrin, but actually during a Tuesday class was the first Challenger explosion, the first failed shuttle. It happened in the middle of a Tuesday class. And people sort of stirred and went out to look at to whatever, find out more about it. I kept right on painting. I was not going to stop. I did not care if the Challenger, it wasn't that I didn't care. I knew very well we would mourn that night. But right now, the best thing we could do was take those precious 3 hours that we had making art and continue to do so. Because it's like a war itself, you know, to do something tender and gentle, like painting what you see, you know, or skillful. That's like a war. Everybody wants to crush that. They don't mean to, but we've got an industrialized system. Just like these efficiency experts say, it's best to do the right things adequately than to try to do everything perfectly. You know, and I'm thinking, okay. And I thought to myself, there's two places you can be a perfectionist and nobody minds too much. One is as an artist and the other is as a housewife. You know, you can do things as perfectly as you want to for your children, as you want to, and nobody will say, that's too perfect. Maybe they will, but it's none of their business. You know, because if you're the housewife, you have one place of authority. That's about those children in that home. How's that?
That's amazing.
How's that for a thought? Do I do some thinking or what?
I'm telling you, Charlotte. We got some good stuff here. The transcribers are going to be just fighting over this one. Well, getting back to the Art Center a second, how would your fellow students, would they have their own show, or would the Art Center?
Lots of people had their shows, and they had some that were two-person shows.
And the Art Center would sponsor this?
Yes, and I would publicize it. I remember one lady named Agnes, I can't remember, and there was another one, Peggy, and I should remember her name. She did these beautiful, realistic, you know, ballerinas and things from photographs, but she changed them enough. But they were amazingly skilled and gorgeous things. Lots of people had exhibits. Till, like I said, we wore Mitty and Bill out posting exhibits, hosting them.
Well, how about the other activities? I know that there were outside exhibits that would come around.
Yeah.
Do you remember, like, for instance, there was a Coca-Cola exhibit?
I remember that.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a print. They would do pulled prints, you know, and embossed prints. There was a print thing. That was print, you know, real prints, like hand-pulled prints of which there is no original, as they say. Those were fascinating. And the Leonardo exhibit. They brought all the school buses in. That was good. Yeah, that was really interesting. And I think they opened that with one of their openings, you know, where we got to come in there, our dress-up clothes and have wine and see what was, you know, talk it up, have a good time with it.
And what about you mentioned briefly the Beaux-Arts Ball.
Yeah.
Now wasn't that a pretty big production?
It was.
For the Art Center
for the area.
Try and accomplish?
Mm-hmm.
Carolyn McMillan was talking about that a little bit. She said it was on Jekyll.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think Beth had a couple of big abstracts in it. Abstracts were fairly big then, and it was kind of exciting, you know.
And this was a very kind of a formal,
yes,
I guess, opening or presentation.
I think they had a dinner dance, and then the art to look at. It was very exciting. Also, there'd be a New Year's party, and people could come in costumes, and Bill was, I remember one of his ideas was to take the year it was, something like 1990, and portray it in gold letters with the gilt peeling off. Time flies,
So clearly it seems like the most important person associated with the Art Center is going to be Bill Hendrix.
Well, it was and is. Then the other thing was, I was one who always saw what Mitty was doing. And being married, I knew as a wife that you carry so much to make the thing go, and plus she just threw her skills into it,
Well, that's a good segue. I was going to ask you about Mitty Hendrix and her role in making all this a success. So she had a lot of administrative skills. How did she make her presence felt? Or how was she involved?
For one thing, when we went on those trips, she did all the details. She carried a handful of vouchers, got us on and off all the planes, at the right place at the right time, and did all that work and got the group together and everything, and arranged for Bill to speak to the group about the trip, made up a brochure about it that I still have somewhere, all of that. She did so many things that people didn't notice, and almost made a practice of not appreciating, which is just, it's one of the, I think it's one of the fallouts of making sort of a personality cult of even a good personality like Bill's, everything's wonderful he does. There can't be another wonderful person here. And that's kind of crazy, because there was another wonderful person there doing entirely different things and glad to do them. But she needed some help with them, and us artists were useless.
But she was not an artist in any way that I know. She certainly
Except she built that house.
Yeah,
that was a beauty.
She appreciated art, but she never was any kind of competition for the artist.
She didn't want to get into it.
No.
She didn't want to get into the artistic side.
Well, do you think that she was sympathetic to the artists? I know she...
Which she certainly worked hard for us, and that was I think it was a 5013C, wasn't it? I didn't learn that term or take it seriously or anything till I went to NAMI for the because I have a youngest son who copes very well with a brain disorder, which is schizophrenia. So I've gone to NAMI, which is this wonderful organization, and I sketched there too. I sketched the meetings. I made a booklet of drawings of these most appealing people. And when I draw, I'm a tape recorder. I could put down the text of what they said after I got the sketch, as I got the sketch done. So I had a booklet, and I ran over to the copy shop in San Diego. I ran over to the copy shop in San Diego and ran that booklet off and sold them to the people at the convention. They were happy. I said, just for the price of the copying, it was like $3.50. And they took all I had, and I took addresses to send more, but I'm very bad about mailing. I'm sorry. I am.
Well, you're not the only one, believe me.
Right.
Well, in 1991, the Glynn Art Association moved out of the Art Center and moved out of the building. Do you have anything you want to talk about that?
Is that when that happened?
1991. So they moved out down to the village and then left the building, so to speak.
You know what I was doing then? From 84 to about 92, I was teaching adjunct at the college, and that's how I got the chance to take Bill's classes and still teach my own classes. And so about 91, I was feeling like sort of I had moved past, I was no longer an art center regular. I was a college, Bill Hendrix at the college regular. See? And then when this happened, I never made the reconnection, more or less. And we were told there wouldn't be a breach, but there was definitely a breach, So does that help answer the question?
Well, the Glynn Art Association is still around, alive, and very viable. What are your impressions of the work they do now?
Well, what's happened is, like in GCA, we have 30 artists, and what's happened is all of us who went through the business of being patient with those early lame efforts, and just being glad to be together, I publicized them for like 8 or 10 years, GCA, which was still Dorothy McLean and me and Janet Scarlett and a whole bunch of people, Marta Torrey and people like that, and just kind of, the exhibits were just not as upscale as they are now. So we went through all of that and kept a cohesion together. And the thing is, we've attracted some marvelous artists in all ways. We get better and better artists all the time. And they're attracted to this group that was formed by Bill, to the ready appreciation for art that is here. And it isn't, I know one time I gave an art history lecture after I came back from Florida State. I won't bore you to death, I hope not. But when I gave this lecture, it was for the lawyers, lawyers and judges golf group. And they come to Sea Island once a year or twice, and it was in the spring. And I gave an art history lecture for the ladies' luncheon. When everybody got together that night, the young men told me at the gathering that they wished that the art history lecture was when they could go too. It was called Art History in 25 Words or Less, sort of like Bill, So is that too much on that?
That's fine. Just a couple more questions about the Art Center.
Okay.
You think it's a good, I think you've already answered that, I think it's a good fit for the community now, the Glynn Art Association.
Well, we're going to always need it. I wish they had something like what they already had, which was the building, that had a good gallery space and really good, it had the best studio space you could ever ask for drawing and having a model and all that good stuff. So we have hurt for that.
We got about 5 more minutes on this tape, but just one last question about the Art Center. St. Simon's in the 50s and St. Simon's of now, which are two vastly different ideas. Do you think that the Art Center that came out of the 50s, could that have happened in today's atmosphere, do you think?
That's a hard question. With that building, it could have, I think it could. And if it had a 501(c), if it had a nonprofit status, I think there'd be even more volunteers and things. It's hard for me with all this to take care of and a family, at least one family member, to get way down at the other end of the island. It's, the absolute other end. It used to meet me halfway at Glynn Art, and so I didn't have but just a little pedal along to get there. It's just not as handy. The Art Center was at the crossroads.
That's right. Where
it was placed.
Yeah.
It was where everything crossed, and you could get there easily, even from Brunswick, as easy as anything. So,
that's a good
point.
It's the location then was conducive to.
Well, this, it was a wonderful setting for a pair like Mitty and Bill. And it definitely would take two like that, somebody to run that highly monitored type of nonprofit organization. Mitty did that. very hard to do. And then someone who's going to be, hey, I'm your daddy, I'm going to protect you while you do art. That was Bill, you know. I'm going to protect you and make you laugh while you do some art. What a good idea, and especially since he knew how to tell you to get it right.
I think that's all the questions I have about the Art Center. And we're about to end this tape, so I'm going to pause this right now.
Okay.
Well, we've come back now, and we're going to resume the final barrage of questions now about Bill Hendrix himself and what you remember.
Okay.
And I wanted to ask you, Charlotte, if you could describe your first memory of Bill Hendrix.
Okay.
How you met him, how you came to know him, all that.
Well, Harriet took me to the Art Center and introduced me to him. And I think he was wearing a khaki shirt and khaki pants, and he was young, you know, and affable and laughed, grinned, got great smile, you know. And I felt welcome, and also what I really liked is he welcomed you in, and then you didn't get so much attention that you were uncomfortable, which I would have been. So that was nice. You just kind of slipped on in, and you were part of the scene. But he did always notice my painting. He did always say something nice about it, you know. And that we would go out then, gnats or no gnats, although people would complain, and certain persons were notable for complaining. I wasn't one back then. I might have been now. But we'd go out and paint all different places, you know, paint in the old marina and with, you know, old truck or something, and just see how amazingly pretty it was in watercolor, you know, with all the palmettos around an old rusty truck and some boards. And so, you know, that's what he did.
Well, do you remember him talking about his art career path? How did he?
It would work into his lessons. It would only work into his lessons that I saw. I'm so surprised that the Art Center was only built in '56. So it must have been maybe as late as '58 before I got there. Because I was busy. But I think it was probably fall of '58. But I always mark it as '57, you know. Yeah.
I don't know much about, you know, where he went to school and, you know, how he studied. Did you get any of that?
He went to the Art Institute, Art Institute in New York, and then before he came here, as far as I knew, he was an instructor in life drawing in Atlanta. And I imagine he learned as much instructing as he would have in a class, you know. And probably he was teaching what he had learned in a class. And then I wrote about him, and I said he would make a joke about his mother having played the piano for opera or something, or having been connected musically, and how he would end up being in a spear carrier in some opera or something. It was so funny the way he'd say that. But I remarked in the piece I wrote about what a nice voice he had, you know, and how that was sort of, it's pleasant to listen to someone who has a good voice, and you don't even know that you're just enjoying that aspect of them. But it is quite a nice, I could imagine him having a good singing voice.
Well, did he ever mention, you know, while you were taking classes or any social aspect, how he knew he was going to be an artist as a career or anything like that? Or I just never heard him speak about that.
No, actually, he would talk about it as if he just kind of segued into it from doing the music thing, you know, when the opera gig ran out. That's the way he tended to talk about his life, you know. He definitely believed in winging it when necessary, it seemed like, you know. And you know, sort of go with the flow. Just trust the flow. Whatever happens, it's going to be a good thing here.
Well, did he ever talk about any of his instructors that were influential for him?
No, I don't know that he did. Oh, he gave me the book, or recommended the book, Robert Henry's The Art Spirit. And I would sit in class reading this. A very good book. It was actually written by Robert Henry's students after he died. So they wrote it from the various things he had taught them during lessons, and it was very well written. It was a very good book. And so he recommended that to me. And also he said that when Grant Wood came into popularity with his little contemporary primitives, you know, of the little early American look of painting, that your father was more interested in Thomas Hart Benton, who painted the emotional things, and he painted all these wavy figures and things, which is also, you know, very distinctively, there's only been one Thomas Hart Benton, you know. But your father said between the two of them, Grant Wood got a greater popularity. Now we don't even know who he is much, but he does have that little iconic picture.
Well, he also did lectures, as you mentioned already. What do you remember about those?
Well, we were really a good audience for colored slides of paintings, of classic paintings, all of us. To sit in that dark room and look at really beautiful paintings for the hour of a lecture. You know, we were like laborers, honestly. All housewife women with children, you're like laborers, because the few hours you have off are so special. And to just sit and look at paintings. I read something that said, in fact, on one of my MLA conventions that I go to, and I sketch them, and I hear what they say. And lots of the things were about life stories, and, you know, they can come in there and give a paper on any kind of literary theme they want to. And one woman was talking about women, how abruptly their education ends at used to traditionally end at the college level. And after that, there was the labor of having to create the career, rear the children, create the home. All of that is quite laborious, and not only that, it's religiously commanded and commended, you know? So it's quite hard. And she said that so many women look back on their college days as the one time they had any leisure, any chance to more or less appreciate those things. This is talking about the average housewife woman who just graduates college and goes. Not necessarily, you know, you got your super rich or whoever can support the arts at a most commendable level. And we're all grateful for it. But I think that was so true of all these women. Harriet and Dot were enormously hardworking, giving parties. I know that sounds like, no, I used to stand in the kitchen with them while we rounded up the, you know, refreshment leftovers and everything that had been prepared, and they worked hard, and they had families, and in families there's always sorrows and difficulties and things with people they love. So I have to make this point again, I'm redundant, but I loved it. When they turned those lights off, Bill had finished sketching for us some little sketch he would make with that wonderful fluidity we all enjoyed. One time he told me when I was going to have to lecture to a group, he said, "We'll draw for him," you know. And true, I could do that, and I have done it. But they turn those lights off and show these big paintings from the Dutch masters, or these wonderful little Flemish things that seem to have a whole bunch of little homes and buildings with windows and turrets. We would just be spellbound as a body. We just totally loved it. And I don't think we were sappy to do so at all. I've spent considerable time explaining that it wasn't that we were just agog. It was that it was the best thing that happened to most of us since college.
It was kind of an intellectual outlet then.
Oh, totally.
That you wouldn't get anywhere
Exactly.
else, or any other
Exactly.
kind of activity.
The conversation, the input he made about it, the descriptions and the locations, he went into all good detail.
Well, you get starved for that kind of thing.
Oh, you were, and yet you hadn't. What? How frivolous! You're going to be a culture vulture, you know? You're going to do art, whatever. But oh, it was such a privilege. And bless her heart, Mitty had to handle all the nitty gritty. Ask people to pay the mere $25 for 3 lectures, which would each take him 5 or 6 days to prepare, you know, every off hour he had to get those slides in and get it researched. And
you went on trips to Europe with...
you left that to last. What are we going to do? I could talk 3 hours about those trips.
Well, that was a tour of, I guess, the old masters. Or
the one I went on,
something.
they called it Footsteps of the Masters. And Bill laughed and said he thought we were getting all kinds of help because they thought it said Footsteps of the Master and thought we were a real Christian group, you know. Which we were. We were all well-behaved, good, right-thinking people from a Christian nation. But we were going to look at the masters who had painted mostly Christian themes. That's who supported all their marvelous work.
So he would he conduct lectures then on these tours?
He would do it before the tour,
Right.
and those wonderful lectures afterwards and before, where he did them in a series. I don't blame him one bit for not doing them, immediately before and things like that. That couldn't be done. The other thing I was thinking, on the trips, they would see everything, but I'd never been to Europe, and so many of them hadn't, and everything, when I recommended it afterwards, people would say, would you go with Bill and me? I would say yes, because the novelty of being in a foreign country, of seeing art in a foreign country, is just the most exciting thing in the world. It was delicious, and of being with them, it was perfect. She took care of everything. But I was saying, now, if you want a lecture, get in his lecture series when you come back. Because over there, they literally won't let someone lecture in the museums, and it's highly competitive among the guides and guards and artists. So we had we loved it. We thought, I thought that trip was the highlight of my life. That and my stint at Florida State, those are just greatest.
I've heard several people make that comment that
we went twice. We went twice, the first and second time. The second time we stayed right in the heart of Venice. I could look out over the sculptures on the Imperial Library that went around the Doge's Palace.
Wow.
It was great.
Well, how about your fellow students? Were they with you? Did a lot of them go that were in your classes?
Yes, they went. It was not necessarily ones who had shared my particular Tuesday class, but some of them were. I can't think of her name at first. There was a Story girl. Her last name was Story. There was a couple. They did a little art business here at first. But we were just, you could do whatever you liked. You could go with Bill for everything, and everything he recommended or had on the list to see was certainly not something you wouldn't miss. And then you could go off and see other things by yourself as you wished. And Bill and Ben would go sometime, and they invited me to go, and I felt that I would be disloyal to the group when they probably were glad to rest their feet, as they often said, in a hard-floored church or something. But they were dear. It was just like this free love. Everybody's pleasant to you, and there's no the few usual hitches, and when you're traveling, you get your tiresomes, but you remember it all as bliss when you come back. And you certainly have plenty to talk to. Until I'd been to a couple of more lectures and an art history class, I was absolutely speechless. And I was taking Toastmasters. I could not think of words to say for how it was all new to me, how marvelously new and world-opening it was for me. just world opening. And when on Christmas Eve we see the Vatican, we see St. Peter's Cathedral with the communion going on, I just sit there and say, I've been there, I know that, it's beautiful. I've been there.
Wow, it makes me want to go right
now. Yeah, really.
Well, to kind of tear ourselves away from that.
Okay.
So how long did you study with Bill Hendrix?
Well,
take
from 1958 all the way through that, after I came, all the way through that, there were gaps, but not much of one. I remember when I decided to go to Florida State and take that teaching assistantship, I was driving home in my station wagon full of wet canvases from Bill's class, just happy as a clam on a Tuesday. And I seriously thought, do you want to leave this and go teach English someplace you've never known? Do you know if you'll even get to paint, whatever? And I actually said something to them about it, and I almost lost my fellowship because there were so young people waiting for them, And they called me back and they said, do you really want this? And I said, yes. I have to take this opportunity. Please don't drop me. But I had enough pause driving home with that canvas, smelling turpentine. We were painting in oils. So I knew this was a happy life. And it's not gooey happy. Everybody has their hardships.
Oh, yeah.
But this was joyful.
So 1958 with gaps
until he retired at the college. I was working with him. When he retired at the college, he recommended me to teach his classes, which was the greatest compliment I ever got. When I want to brag, which I often do, I call it rejoicing.
I like that.
When I want to rejoice, I tell him that Bill nominated me to follow in his tracks because I had taken both his Jansen courses. I wrote that exam that showed I had comprehended it all. He knew I did. He knew I heard every word he said. See, that's what you get for being the oldest daughter, close to your dad, close to your mom. You're going to listen.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but you're right. So how do you account for all that length of time? Did you still continue to learn?
Because, yes. Oh, heavens, yes. And then that's what I discovered. There's so much to learn about the techniques, the materials. They're fascinating. The art history, there's more and more to learn about that. But the best way for me to learn it is to just keep painting because you keep wanting to create something wonderful. And that puts you of a mind with all the artists in the centuries gone by. So you're ready to learn anything you can about them. But on the other hand, you're not in this awe that regards all that knowledge as an elite and above you because you've had someone normalize it for you like Bill did. He normalized art for us, which is an amazing accomplishment.
Well, I believe that was one of his kind of philosophy, that he thought that art should not be just simply for the elite. It should be able to be appreciated by all, and therefore would enhance your life.
Exactly. You said it.
That's exactly the way I've seen him write that several times.
I missed saying that, but I think I've said it a lot of other ways.
Well, in those classes, I think you've already kind of touched on this one time. There were people. Maybe they were there not too long, these students, that you judge really didn't have much talent to be there. Now, how would he handle people like that?
Well, I consider them the same way he did, as beginners. He never considered anyone, quote, untalented, and we didn't talk about talent much. I mean, I don't remember that we did. I mean, maybe he did, but I just blanked out about talent because I felt like that saying, talent's distributed about like acorns, but you don't see that many oak trees. The acorns come down 5 pounds to your patio, but there's just about 3 or 4 oak trees that make use of every cell of water they get. How's that?
I think that's a really cool analogy. I haven't heard that one before. Well, can you recall any stories you might have talked about his past. Like you already mentioned, his mother was she was a pianist, and they did travel around when he was a child. Any other stories that you can remember?
He wouldn't do that. He wouldn't tell us stories. He would joke with us. He'd play with us. He'd talk to us, and that's what we wanted. If you were his child, I'm afraid we got all his attention. We got that, I think you're wonderful attention that you get from a dad or somebody, oh, isn't this fun? And oh, let me make you laugh. That was what he did.
Well, now I'm going to quote you, and I want to talk about this. This is something I found in the records, the Governor's Awards in the Arts.
Oh, yeah, I read that you sent me.
And this, I think, is the argument for the nomination that you have written here. I'll just quote you here. It says, "We believe that the incredible number of people ready to attest to his depth of influence in their art studies and opportunities is evidence of where and how he has spent his time and heart in these 25 years, teaching wholeheartedly out of a magnificent personal drawing, painting ability." Was that your argument for
totally
nominating?
Yeah, and I'm glad I said it that well. I can, I'm really glad, because it's like you can tell from me, I wander everywhere trying to say it. So I'm glad I got down to business there.
Well, tell me what happened. What was the outcome of this nomination? There were quite a few testimonies that I
there were a lot of them,
records.
And well, the outcome. I don't think he got the nomination, did he? I mean, the thing. And I think, did I tell you in my email that I went to the ceremony or whatever? Somehow or other, I got to the ceremony in Atlanta, which wasn't too hard. My family lives in Atlanta. So, and I remember one of the big features was, and I've seen this before, some people who worked with the deaf got them to do a musical because they could feel the rhythm, and they had them in little cowboy outfits, and it was adorable and everything. But I actually have a pretty good idea of something told me, but I don't know that I need to put it on the oral history.
Okay.
You know what I mean? I think,
That's
let's
fine.
put it like this. This is what you say when you don't have the teaching job you want. It really was politics, some political interference.
Well, I tell you, I have read those testimonies, and I don't know how in the world. I mean, they're from
How
all
they
over
passed
the
him
board.
over. Exactly.
There's from senators to just the most common, or I'd say, the most
to ordinary people.
down-to-earth person.
Yeah.
I don't understand that one, but I think you're right.
It was politics. And, Bill didn't, it seemed to me that this thing of competing for a prize or the, quote, best painting or the best this or that, he always felt there was a whole lot of fiction involved in choosing any, quote, best thing. It was very subjective. And I don't think he had much patience with the types of boards and things that would make the choices. And God bless them for raising the issue at all about the arts and everything. But sometimes there's just what is it? Sort of a pack mentality. So-and-so is a good person and she's having such a hard time, such and such. Or, yes, look at these people, they can't hear, but they can dance.
Right.
Well,
that's pretty common, that kind of.
But I was very pleased that, he did encourage us to go on and enter those exhibits. Ken Wallen's a good example of a painter who began with Bill, and I guess you know that. But he went right on and he entered every exhibit, win, lose, or draw, and that's a good example of the kind of attitude you have to take to it.
Well, did you ever see Bill Hendrix with the potential to be a major contributor to art in America, 20th century art? had he not taken a route of teaching and maybe just concentrated on?
I couldn't tell. I had no capacity to judge his ranking with other artists. It seemed to me that he had chosen teaching pretty much even before he announced that the teaching had become more important to him than producing painting. He was so wonderful as a teacher. It was almost like he gave us his dreams, dream to always love painting and to always be ready to do it, to get at it, as Judy Cameron says.
Well, maybe that's the way he felt that he could contribute, make his best contribution in the field of art.
Yeah, because who was going to mount his exhibits except Mitty? Who was going to show his work? When he came back from Mexico, we had a beautiful show. And people didn't respond like you would think. I have like that one painting there that came from the Mexico show, and I got it out of the bin, bought it out of the bin. So, it's like they say, when you give so much and just give out of a bounty and give everything you got, people suspect your motives or something. They never suspected it was motives, but they don't take it that, do you know what I mean? Gratefully. Don't take it that gratefully. If you give bountifully, they think you've just got a bunch to give, sort of. That's a human trait, isn't it?
Way to put it, then, I think.
Yeah.
That's a good way to put it. Well, you studied many years with him. Did you see a change in emphasis over the years of what he thought was important in your paintings? In other words, did he start out maybe with an emphasis here and then later as things?
One time he stood up in one of the classes, we were starting to work, and he said, it was so funny, so like him. He said, now, if you all were in a real art school, you'd do 20 drawings of a hand. You'd do 30 drawings of a life study figure. Like it says in The Natural Way to Draw, you'd do 15 hours on one exercise. That's 5 3-hour classes, whatever. And you would just work so much more often and more than you do. And everybody just looked at him and, aghast. And whether they did or not, he says, "Oh my gosh, forget I said that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it." That was so funny. But I think that's true, though. I think he meant it. He meant you're playing around too much. You're painting just when you get to it, or if you think about it, or whatever. And if you want to make progress, and if I'm going to show that my students, I guess, are really accomplishing something, he started then having afternoon charcoal drawing classes. And every single, after Tuesday afternoon, and both his classes ran Tuesday and Thursday then. So if you came both mornings, you could also draw for 3 hours in the afternoon. And that was quite intensive, but you had reverent classes. I mean, you see a life study class, they're trying to get that right, and they just stand there. And it is a reverent sort of place, They look over, they get their little space, and they draw. And he normalized that experience for you, So how's that? Does that...
He scared everybody.
Yeah. But he really was being earnest. He was saying, I feel bad amusing and entertaining you and encouraging you and letting you just do as you whether or not you want to put in the time. Let me tell you what you do if you really want to progress. See, because he probably got tired of people saying, as he showed them how to do it, they would say, "Well, Bill, that's easy for you to do." What did they expect? That it not be? Or that they be as supple as he was without doing what he said? How's that?
That's a good answer. And speaking of that, kind of studies, he got all these studies and sketches, just thousands upon thousands of
Oh,
them.
yeah. And they make a
and,
beautiful collection.
and a lot of these are the human form
Mm-hmm.
in various ways.
Yeah.
Why do you think he was, especially faces and figures? I mean, it's just so many of those in every attitude you can imagine.
That's kind of what he was requiring of himself, what he told us. You have to do many and multiples and get fluent in it and have especially have an eye, an analytical eye. You know, that you could say why something looks the way it does, analyze it.
Well, I think that explains what I'm seeing, a lot of those, than what you just said.
Oh, they're so beautiful, though. I've got one of him. He has a couple on a motorcycle. It's just a drawing of them. But he has taken the watercolor and dappled them with this, as he said, breakup, reversing the plane, as he put it. And it really is beautiful. And he could have done, if he was in the production mode, he could have done masses of those and have it recognized as Bill Hendrix's style. But he never wanted to apparently start off in one of those. He kept experimenting, didn't he? He's sort of like Leonardo like that. Not going to take a church commission, going to invent flying. An impossible fly. And he did fly in an airplane.
We're just a few more questions here. In 1978, his son Matthew died unexpectedly at 18, and I was wondering if you noticed any change in his teaching approach or his artwork or philosophy after that, because it really was a devastating event.
Oh, it just crushed him. And see, my son was exactly Matthew's age, and it was so hard on me too, because they were so subject at that period of time in the mid-70s. I was teaching school. And this island was sort of swept with a lot of not so good influences, and they were so susceptible. And it just broke my heart for Matthew. He was in the 7th grade where I was teaching. So I would see him on occasional, and he'd always speak to me and everything, had that long black hair, was just so cute. And I know that your daddy did some things for the Presbyterian Church, and those drawings are still around there and very much valued, There's different concepts that he made on these different Bible stories and scenes. That's how he survived it, I think. He just had to survive it some way. But as far as I remember, I don't think he closed too many classes. As is often the case for him and Mitty both, work took their mind off things. I know that was the year Matthew went to Mexico with Bill and Ben and everybody. Did you go?
I didn't go. I went
That
one
trip?
time. They went twice, but I only went once.
Okay. Well, he did get to go with them, and the school teachers, one of them, they were just talking about that. How could he do that or whatever? And I thought, how wonderful. How could he not take Matthew with him? And so that's what, I remember about Matthew. I don't remember, Bill. What year was that? Do you remember?
It was 1978 that Matthew died. But I know, he wrote quite a bit about this, and I've just recently come across that, and it really rocked him down to the bedrock.
Really? Your dad, yes, he was poetic as a writer, too, when he wanted to write. He used to try to stop me from writing, though. He wanted me to give it all to painting. Yeah, he did. He said, now, you just got to do one thing or the other. You're making it hard for yourself. And that's true, but I was too, I had both backgrounds. I couldn't help it. And he wrote beautifully. So I'm telling you, if he wrote about losing Matthew, I'm sure that must be hard to read or to picture him going through.
It's pretty hard to read, I'll tell you.
He was a beautiful, beautiful young man.
Well, did he mention any processes or ideas that he was experimenting with on his own?
Well, you see the sketchbooks. That's where he's experimented on his own. And he did just constantly, And he had a couple of canvases that he would work on a little bit, but he would stop if he didn't feel anything too interesting going on. So,
Well,
I think those sketchbooks, and you say you've got more than these 2 notebooks. I want to see some of those because, like I told you in that one with the enormous line work that was like Rembrandt's, he has a woman holding out her hand, and he did the most beautiful line work, and he taught me to do that too. Are we going to get to look at the paintings? Because I can talk about that too.
We're getting there.
Yeah, because I was going to say the line work, at that time he told me, it's not the drawing that really matters, it's what you do to it, you know? And he said Rembrandt would add all this wonderful line work. And I've got 2 of Bill's drawings over there of that type. So I'm sorry, I just can't stop when we start.
Two last questions here.
Okay.
In his later years, how did you see him wind down? Did you notice? I mean, he did wind down. Was there anything you noticed in sense?
I remember, when he retired at the college, do you remember what year that was?
You know, he kept saying he was going to retire, so I'm not quite sure when exact year that was. I'd have to look that up.
Well, I know that was before I ever taught at Hoboken, so it was in the 80s sometime, because I started teaching at Hoboken in 89. That was when I had gone through the college thing for so long.
Okay. And lastly, Charlotte, what was your last memory of Bill Hendrix?
Well, let me see. It's just hard to put them in chronology. I know I wrote about it in the article I wrote about him. I wrote about waylaying him at the Art Center. And he had an appointment to do something, so he was just going to pick up something to eat over at Hardee's. That was when Hardee's was fairly roomy, you know, and you could get in there and get a table. So I went with him, and we had a hamburger at Hardee's, and we talked. And that was when Sea Island or somebody was offering to build him another art center, a bigger one, or maybe on that same site. And I know I believe that I recall, Ed Cheshire had offered a modular design. It was real practical for this age and time. And there had been the usual artistic contentions about everything. Everybody got into the act, and it was very, you know, didn't come about, which was just so, you know, strange. It's his giftedness and everything, it just made people arrogant and that ridiculous, but I mean, you know, and contentious that everybody decided they were an artist or an art historian or everything, because Bill had said we could be. Okay. So it turned on him. This is just I made that up. This is just an analysis, you know. But what I'm saying is that your dad and I talked, and I think you read that he sketched out for me his vision of what probably someday someone will do, just because it is absolutely so different. You know, no one's ever suggested doing this, but he wanted to take this triangle of land and build a good art center up on stilts with elevators, which is not so unusual. You know, you have to have elevators. And then it was going to show that art lays the egg for all of the wonderful, you know, tourist life and the attractiveness of this area, which is so true. The arts do, between the literature and the painting, and it just is, like people say in the paper, somebody did today, it is a blessed area for that sort of thing. And Bill fit right in there. And he said it was going to be a ceramic egg so that it mirrored on the outside the sky and the lovely beauty of the area, and would show when you drove up that you were in this very special landscape, and that it was created, or that it was fertilized by the egg of the arts, you know. I love it. I love it. I like to think about it as part of his vision, you know.
Well, on that note, is there any other thing you can think of you'd like to add?
Well, now how do I do that? I'm going to kick myself for every opportunity I've missed when we finish this. But I just remember him showing up at 6 o'clock in the morning at the college to review that Jansen text. And then I've got this tape recording over there that I love to hear. I wish you could put a snippet of it on here. How, you know, we could get the little set and listen to it. It's just a phrase or two, anyway, on there of him laughing and of him telling someone who left the class, I told a dirty joke while you were gone, you should have been here. And that would make everybody laugh because, of course, he didn't.
All right. Well, on that note, we'll conclude this part of the interview, and thank you very much.
Okay.
So we're going to talk about some paintings.
Okay.
Here we go. Go
Okay.
ahead, Charlotte.
Okay.
Lead the way.
This is a painting that is very much Bill Hendrix influenced. And I had such a good time painting it, and he was just about standing over my shoulder while I worked on it. I think I had it on the floor because even though this is the Lone Ranger, and I always take it to school and tell the children that we had a horse in our family, and it belonged to my sister, and she wouldn't let me ride it. So when I grew up, I painted the Lone Ranger riding a horse. And the drawing is little more than a cartoon, you know, just a line drawing. But, as Bill always said, what you put on in the way of interest, in the way you handle the paint, is going to make your painting. And I sat there with great pleasure, echoing all the forms in these lines, first with a big brush. And then I went back and hatched with the sides of the brush, hatched with the edges, and I hatched it, and then I speckled it with a brush. That's not a spatter. So all of this, it's been one of my favorite paintings. It's been one of the favorites of the kids at school, but it is also, I don't really paint like that as a rule. I would love to do it again. It is a typical Bill Hendrix recommendation that just keep going, he said, just keep going. Put some more of that and some more of that. And he was so right about that. And here's a couple of things he would do. Darks and the pinches, right there, these darks. And you don't see them. You look at it and you see the Lone Ranger, but there's darks placed to tell you where you want to look. And then there's all that rocking motion. I'm telling you, there's a rocking motion to it, too, which is what I used to love about riding the horse with my sister, because I got to ride behind the saddle, rock.
Okay.
And that's one of his. These are my latest style, this is my Aunt Pat's. It says Summer Dinner with My Aunt, and I take that into the schools, and it's also been at hospice, all of these family-oriented ones. But see, I did them from memory, so I remembered, this is called Summer Dinner with My Aunt, who had everything. That was my impression. And here I'm sitting, and here are we, as seen in silhouette through the shears. The light is coming through the shears, and that's what it did to us. And that's how visual I was as a child. And when I show these to school children, they immediately know that we're silhouetted in the curtains, you know, and they get it, they really pick up on that. And then in the back it just has a little vignette of crabs, because this aunt would take us all fishing and crabbing, and then we'd come home and have this enormous feast with all her antiques and things she had that we loved. So I'm painting in that vein with these memories. I want to show you one more like that. Is the other, or one other. It's the last one I did of the family memories. And it's called Prayer and Penicillin Saved Little Sister. And we were called out of school one day when I was in the 10th grade. And because my sister had appendicitis and it had ruptured, and so she very nearly died, and it was one of the first penicillin saves, you know. And so my aunts, my two aunts and my grandmother all came to comfort Mother, who felt very much at fault for not getting her medical attention soon enough. A neighbor had to tell Mother and help her to get to a doctor. But I loved the way they came. The memory came from the fact that they came to the hospital gorgeously dressed, because I see now and did not see when I remembered this. All I remember was that the family royalty was there at our side, and how wonderful it was that they were, you know, to me and to Helen. And now I realize that they drove 700 miles thinking they were coming to Virginia's funeral because they were dressed for it, see. I wouldn't have thought that. To me, and isn't that funny how a thing emerges from a memory that you couldn't read as a girl? You remember it because to you it was just, like I said, that they were there and they were all dressed for a big occasion, and suddenly I realized what that was. And aren't we fortunate that prayer and penicillin saved her? So it's a good family-like memory, and that's been my direction lately. And I even go way back to my grandmother, let's see, she was just my great-grandmother, her Helen. She finished medical school in 1892, and this is called Last House Call in Boston, because she died at 63 with bronchial asthma, and she, as a woman physician, she mainly attended other women, and she would go out in bad weather in Boston to see if they, you know, to see to them. And so I painted this. A lot of people have liked this painting. But I take it into the schools, too, to show how far back your memory and your history can go. So then this is another one in the family series, and you talk about a memory. This was a total memory of my grandmother's living room, the whole architecture and everything. I could sit it somewhere.
Can you
Sit it? Yeah, I'll sit it in front of that one for a second or two, yeah.
You got about 8 minutes.
Okay, well, you'll just have to stop me or whatever.
We'll go to the end.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's great.
This was such a marvelous house that we loved. It was in Norfolk, Virginia, on Colonial Avenue, where they moved after Raleigh. And it shows me down here looking for a role model when I was about 12 in a vacation at my grandmother's for about a week. And I'm sitting down there playing with my princess paper dolls. So I put paper doll tabs on all my potential role models. There's my mother, primping a little bit, and my uncle who was in the Army, and my aunt who was one of the first women to work at the shipyards in Norfolk, you know, in slacks and all. So this was in about 1945 as the war was getting over. And this was my grandmother. She was a writer, and she also encouraged my art, but she really encouraged my writing. She'd come home from church, put her apron over her good dress, roll her stockings down, sit down at that typewriter, write an article for the paper, which I very much followed her in doing. It's my other uncle in the Army. And this I always tell the children, this at school, this is my Aunt Margaret on her 5th child, pregnant with her 5th child, and smoking her last pack of Lucky Strikes. And we all go, oh, didn't she know any better? And they do, you know, oh, no, they didn't know, because everybody's smoking. My daddy is smoking. He's over here. And what I loved is this. Can you imagine how much fun it was to play on those stairs?
I can cut that out.
Okay. This is from this son overseas serving his country, and the little pictures of all the family and the piano, and they would sit there and play the hymns for us to see. So it makes a great memory, and I'm surprised as I look at it. I did it several years ago, that I can still, that I ever remembered it in such detail. And here's a Bill Hendrix thing, among many others. If you couldn't figure where this corner went when it got down that far to the floor, put your pot plant there. And there's another one that covers my lack of explanation for those banister railings. So I had more fun with the plants than with but still that was a fun architecture to remember. It was a time of being so happy and protected and just loving being at my grandmother's. And this is the front door. I always tell them there's always a mirror in here. It's a mirror that we're standing at the front door with the big crepe myrtles in bloom outside and the sunlight coming through. It's just such fun it's fun to paint, as you can imagine. As it comes to you, you just start, how can I get all this in here? I did this as an ink drawing first and projected it on the canvas like this with an overhead projector. And that way the ink drawing had already got in the detail and I could just bring it out in the paint. So that was fun to do. And this has been sort of my own development, to go to what detail I want to use or can use. It's not as strong as something like a single figure with lots of ornamentation. That's very dramatic. And I can see the difference, And I bet you your father went through that too, knowing that he had choices and not sure what he wanted to choose to do.
Let's see if I can get it wide, Charlotte. Yeah, I think we got time for one more.
Okay.
One more, if you,
all right.
If you want to do one more. Sure.
Oh, well, that's when I changed to acrylics. Well, this is acrylic too. But when we were first changing to acrylic, I painted this painting as a sort of a sampler of how to do acrylic. And I think I was using only the natural colors, the more natural colors like this. And I put the church in there. There's St. John the Baptist in Savannah. I put the cameras, and then I titled it Thinking About Marilyn, because here's the real Marilyn here studying her script. And she's cute and healthy and humorous. And here's her personas that she portrayed. And I just thought we ought to think about Marilyn. She didn't live but such a short time. And Ayn Rand said of her that she was the most mistreated and misjudged person she'd ever seen. Said Christianity tends to honor a victim and kill the joyous. And they would mock her and kill her because she was joyous. So I thought that was a pretty good thing for us church folks to think about. Nothing wrong with some joy and some beauty and all. That's sort of what I was thinking about. But I painted that, I think I had about 3 months in Bill's studio out there at the college where I was also teaching, and the studio would be empty in the afternoon, and I would paint and work while I prepared for my evening class too. So how about that? This one I love. I know you're just about through, where we can just cut me off. But this is my grandmother's bedroom, and what it represented to me was the enormous range of freedom she had as a housewife, which we in our smaller home and little nuclear family did not quite have. My mother never seemed to have this range of interest. There's grandmother's desk that had belonged to her father's law office. There's her typewriter. And here's her letters and her hat and all this. And the room means to convey space and scope. And the blowing curtains represent the freedom, her freedom, both her freedom and the summer. The freedom of summer and being there, without school, without pressure. I hope it conveys that. Maybe I should say my grandmother's room in the summertime. And this was 2 big double beds, you know, and here's the mirror once again, shows her sewing machine and everything in full that you can't really see in the rest. Okay, how's that?